Hello, everyone. I'm Rabbi Edmond Weiss, and I'd like to present to you my sermon for Shabbat Tshuva, which comes this Saturday. The sermon is called Who by Fire, or My Yom Kippur Problem. During the days of awe, we think about mortality, specifically about living another year. According to our tradition, our fate for the next year has already been decided by the Almighty, but if it's a decision against us, we have 10 days to humble ourselves and promise that we'll be deserving of a second chance. Now, can an ordinary man or woman increase the chance of living another year? Of course. We all know that if we eat right, drink moderately, keep active, and nowadays use a face mask and keep social distance, we have a better chance in the life expectancy lottery. But these measures are not what the high holidays are about. Given that life in the book is a reward for correct Jewish behavior, and that's what it says in our prayer book, what can we do to merit another year? The easier answer is that we should obey all the commandments, the mitzvot, that apply to us. But if you study all the mitzvot in the Torah, you will rarely find a claim that obedience leads to long life. The contract or brit is in exchange for Israel, the promised homeland. Our end of the deal, our obligation, is the mitzvot, and God's end of the deal is Israel, except for three interesting cases. Mitzvah 33, according to the way Maimonides counted them, appears in Exodus 20, and it says, "Honor thy father and thy mother, that thy days may be long upon the land which the Lord thy God has given thee." Mitzvot 5:44 and 45, which are tied together, come from Deuteronomy 22:6. If you come across a bird's nest beside the road, either in a tree or on the ground, and the mother is sitting on the young or on the eggs, do not take the mother with the young. You may take the young, but be sure to let the mother go, so that it will go well with you and you may have a long life. Now, Mitzvah 602, also from Deuteronomy, it says, "Do not have two differing weights in your bag, one heavy and one light. Do not have two differing measures in your house, one large and one small. You must have accurate and honest weights and measures, so that you may live long in the land the Lord your God is giving you. For the Lord detests anyone who does these things, anyone who deals dishonestly." Now, apparently, respect for one's parents and honesty in business, the first and third, are especially important, a matter of life and death, and we can understand that. But what of the birds? Why would mishandling some chicks or eggs result in such a severe penalty? Well, the commentators have no problem with this paradox. They tell us that the profound emphasis on kindness to the smallest of creatures makes even more potent the importance of kindness to other people, and as Hillel would say, kal v'chomer. In fact, it may be more significant even than that. The bird law figures in the life of one of the legendary rabbis of the Talmud, Elisha the apostate, also known as Aher the other. And Elisha's story relates directly to the question in this sermon: does God reward with life and punish with death? Of course, to many of us, the question is absurd on its face. But to most Jews, it is the core fear, the awe that signals their humility and submission. I'll wager that many Jews who attend shul only on Yom Kippur, and you know who you are, even the sophisticated ones, are afraid that something bad will happen to them if they don't. What about Elisha? Elisha the apostate did many things to annoy his rabbi colleagues. He insisted, for example, that the mind was improved by reading non-Jewish books, and that communication with Greek scholars and philosophers could be civilizing rather than automatically corrupting to our people. But the thing that drove him from his people was that he stopped believing that life and death were rewards and punishments from God. The Talmud relates that one day Elisha is strolling and discussing Torah with his disciple, Rabbi Meir, when he notices an older man and a young boy walking with a ladder toward a large tree. The man leans the ladder against the tree, and the boy scurries up to fetch the eggs in a nest. Knowing the Torah, the boy shoos away the mother bird before he collects the nest full of eggs. Now, this event, it impresses and it pleases Elisha and Meir. Elisha reminds us that the boy is performing two mitzvot, honoring his father and shooing away the mother bird, both of which, coincidentally, promise long life. But at that same moment, the boy falls from the ladder, hits his head on the ground, and dies. This event transforms Elisha. He sees in it that the promises of the Torah are false. Not only one divine promise broken, but two. And at this point he pronounces, like most people who believe in all or nothing, he says there is no justice and there is no judge. He renounces and rejects the Torah, and for the most part, he abandons the Jewish people. The Talmud deals with that story in this way. What happened, he wondered, to this lad's good life? What happened to his long promised life? Unfortunately, says the Talmudic writer, unfortunately, Elisha was not aware of the interpretation of Rabbi Yaakov, who had already given the passage. Thus, you will have a good life in the next world, which is entirely good, and a long one in the future life, the Olam Haba, where everything lasts long. But this observation, you should forgive me, is just sleight of hand. We are told repeatedly in the Talmud that every Jew has a portion in the world to come, except for those few who violate a few specific prescriptions. And since the world to come, the Olam Haba, is eternal, everyone lives just as long there, no matter what they've done. And to be particularly blunt, the plain meaning of the Torah says nothing about reward in the afterlife. It speaks of a long life on this side of the next world, just as do the prayers in the Yom Kippur service. Actually, the traditional written Torah doesn't speak much about an afterlife at all. Now, my Yom Kippur problem is this. Inherent in the traditional Jewish metaphysic is the proposition that the length of our lives and the day of our death is a judgment, specifically a righteous judgment made by God Almighty. Mourners even use that word, that phrase, Dayan Emet, at funerals, the righteous judge, to illustrate. The rabbis want to know why Sarah was not given as long a life as Abraham. And Genesis Rabbah speculates that Sarah should have reached Abraham's age, which was 175 years, but that 48 years were taken away because of her readiness to dispute with Abraham over Hagar. You see, there has to be a reason that she didn't live as long as he did. It's hard to accept this central concept because it is almost certainly false. It is, in short, a superstition, a belief in a causal connection between two things that have no causal connection. And it is made even more bizarre by the notion that if one is especially well behaved during the days of awe, especially if one makes a generous donation to the shul, the death verdict can be unsealed. The Yom Kippur prayers legitimize the single most wrong-headed notion in our religion, namely that people suffer and die as divine punishment. Of course, the Book of Life narrative makes sense to children who have been raised on a diet of fairy tales. As children in Hebrew school, we learned that an aged God, looking like the man in the Sistine Chapel painting, watches humankind march past him, deciding who gets written to live another year. And since none of us knows who has been marked for death, we're all obliged to pray like crazy and heap scorn on ourselves, grovel, supplicate, anything to get a death sentence changed before it is sealed by the Almighty. Now, for a child, this is a deliberate harrowing. It's an introduction in what may be the most psychologically crippling idea of them all, that our imperfections are the explanation for our deaths, especially for those who die young. What did I do to deserve this? Wonders the dying teenager. My late son, dying from brain cancer in his 40s, like Joe Biden's poor son, Beau. He decided it must be a punishment for misbehavior against his wife, as if he didn't have enough to feel bad about already. In psychiatric terms, this belief is a form of what is called infantilism, the kind of idea that very young children have about the omniscience and the omnipotence of their parents, which they're supposed to outgrow. Children, like a good many adults, do not apprehend that the book of life is just a metaphor. In my own youth, for example, the rabbis at Hebrew school used the Yom Kippur threat as a way of scaring us into observance. And by simple extrapolation, our children grow up thinking that not only are death, but also lesser punishments, pain, disease, loneliness, childlessness, poverty, mental illness, all of these must be consequences of failing to observe the commandments. Most of the people in Crown Heights believe that, you know. The Shema promises rain in its season, which is prosperity, and to those who obey, and by inference, to those who don't obey, flood and poverty and hunger. And in Moses' great oration at the end of the Torah, he warns the Israelites that if they fail to keep the commandments, they will be sold back into Egyptian slavery, they will lose their homeland, and when they arrive in Egypt as slaves, no one will even bid on them. Now, to a sophisticated person, Yom Kippur is religious theater, a mixture of dark music, hunger, and fatigue, all of which enable us a sense of humility, an appreciation for the fragility of life, a resolution to improve oneself, a reminder of how much pleasure there is in a single piece of bread. But to children, it is a horror show, a brainwashing that may cloud their thinking through the rest of their lives. Well, not much can be done about my Yom Kippur problem. Everything about Yom Kippur is exceedingly dear to Jews of all denominations. We're stuck with Kol Nidre here, and I doubt I could convince any mainstream synagogue to lift out the Unintan and Tokev. Instead, my advice would be to those who, like me, find this core idea not only illogical but repugnant, that they should form independent Havarot or study groups to spend Yom Kippur together in prayer and meditation and reflection. In particular, I want them to reflect on the routine and widespread suffering and death of innocent people, especially now during this plague, and the implication of that for theism in general and Judaism in particular. And they should be unafraid of where this thought process will lead them. As a mystical friend of mine once put it, God does not require us to believe anything that is false. Those of us who have exceeded our biblical allotment of 70 years also might do well to tell our grandchildren, and if you're lucky enough, your great-grandchildren, that while there are many things we can do to make ourselves healthier and protect ourselves from danger, there is no reason to believe that failing to act righteously would really shorten your life. Instead, let us teach honorable behavior, let us teach morality, let us teach ethics, let us teach justice and fairness through reasonable arguments and by the example of how we live our own lives, instead of invoking divine threats and punishment. Perhaps we should teach our children Einstein's conception of God. He said, Judaism is not a creed. The Jewish God is simply a negation of superstition, an imaginary result of its elimination. But on the other hand, he complained. He says Judaism is also an attempt to base the moral law on fear, which is a regrettable and discreditable attempt. Einstein said, I believe in Spinoza's God, who reveals himself in the orderly harmony of what exists, not in a God who concerns himself with the fates and actions of human beings and motivates them with fear. Shana Tova, my friends.